Dr. Nardi here, and in this video we are going to talk about memory and why it is so important for your everyday life. So if you would imagine what your life would be without memory. Imagine if you had some kind of impairment to your memory. Think about it. When you first wake up in the morning, you know whether you need to jump out of bed and hurry off and get ready for work or school or go meet a friend for coffee, whatever that might be. You remember from the minute you wake up about each task you have to do. Well, unless you write it down. However, without memory, you would not know what you need to do that day. You wouldn't even know where you are or who you are or what you're supposed to be doing at any given moment. It would be like waking up disoriented every moment of the day. And there's a very extreme example of this. His name was Clive Waring. And it was a man in the United Kingdom who suffered a brain injury due to an illness from encephalitis. And from that illness, the area of his brain known as the hippocampus, where a lot of your memories are stored, and the surrounding brain tissue was damaged. And due to this damage, Clive lost his ability to know what was going around him. He couldn't remember for more than a minute at a time. So think about how important memory is to your everyday life and functioning. Aristotle said memory is like wax. It can be molded, melted, and remolded over time. So I guess Aristotle looked at his memory as a wax tablet, right? That again, that can be molded and remolded. Memory has also been thought of a sort of filing system where information is organized in different ways. Right? So you have all animals stored together in your filing system, all colors are stored together. And this is depending how your memory is encoded and how it's retrieved. But both of these ideas of memory kind of look at it as a thing, as a storage unit or a structure where information is held. However, memory can also be thought of as a collection of interdependent processes. In other words, rather than thinking of memory as a thing, memory can be thought of more as remembering. Researchers who adhere to this view of memory focus more on how memory acts and what happens when memory, or I should say when remembering occurs, rather than memory as a storage structure or unit. Now, there are three important processes in memory, at least from one theoretical standpoint. Researchers often talk about encoding. This is the process by which information enters our memory. It is sometimes fairly active process, such as you reading this text right now, or taking a quiz, or trying to remember the material you're learning in a course. It can also be less active, like when information is encoded without even intending to remember it. For example, if you're listening to a song and then you just remember it, whether it's intentional or not intentional, for information to be encoded, there has to be some attention paid to that information. That's often required on some level. Now, storage is the process by which information is kept in memory. This is basically connecting with one's pre-existing knowledge. This is important in the retrieval process, as information seems to be stored with related concepts. So there is a connection, a web. We also call that sometimes a schema about how the world works. Now, there is no single place in the brain where an individual memory is kept. Instead, memories seem to be distributed across multiple areas of the brain. The biggest area we always think of, and the most important, I should say, is the hippocampus. And that is a very specific brain area that's involved with pooling the pieces of memory back together when it's retrieved. The last part is the retrieval process. Like encoding, the retrieval process can be intentional, such as when you attempt to remember what you had for breakfast last Thursday, or you try to remember the name of your instructor, or it could be unintentional, such as when you suddenly remember the correct answer to an exam question at 3 a.m. the day after you took the exam. Now, we have different types of memory. Sensory, which are brief. So sensory memory is very brief. Short-term memory, which is roughly about 30 seconds or less, unless encoded, and we'll get into more detail here in a minute. And long-term memories, they could potentially last over one's lifetime. And one of the earliest models of memory is known as the Modal model of memory. And this model describes these types of memories along with the hypothetical structures that hold memories for different lengths of time. So sensory memory, as I kind of briefly alluded to, sensory memories are raw, unprocessed sensory information. For example, if you focus your eyes on a bright scene, you know, if you look out the window, turn your head, if you're sitting in the dark right now, look out the window at a bright scene, then close your eyes. You will see a brief after image of that scene, but it fades very quickly. This is sensory memory. It's a visual representation of the scene that exists in the sensory form and is lost from memory within a second or two. Now, sensory memories can be stored for a very brief period of time for each of our senses, but these memories have been very difficult for researchers to measure because of their brief duration. Short-term memory, you could look at this as an intermediate memory storage that begins processing of perceptual information transferred from sensory memory. Information that becomes the focus of attention moves from sensory memory to short-term memory. Now, if you remember Clive Wearing, the gentleman I alluded to earlier, the person who had amnesia, could hold memories in his short-term memory for just a short period of time. But once his attention moved on, those memories were lost. The term working memory is also used to describe the system, by the way, that controls the process and activation of information held in short-term memory. So you'll hear that term as well. Now, people want to know, what's the capacity? What's the capacity of short-term memory? And most researchers believe it's 7 plus or minus 2 pieces of information. So basically, think about phone numbers are about 7 digits. Any longer, we wouldn't remember them. Even though you'll say, wait, there's an area code. Area codes are usually, chunked together. So it's not an issue because we can chunk things together, like grouping things, like a phone number, like 555, 555, 5555. We group those so we can remember more stuff. So chunking is a mechanism we could use to help us remember more information. Basically, it's organizing information to more meaningful chunks. But without that, it's about 7 plus or minus 2 pieces of information. How long do short-term memories last? Well, as I said, they don't last very long, about 30 seconds or so without rehearsal. So without active rehearsal, like repeating yourself, right? So if you're trying to remember a phone number like 8675309, that's a very old song. That's Jenny's phone number. If I repeat that over and over again, that's active rehearsal. Now, sometimes what happens is what we call retroactive interference. It's when a person has a difficulty recalling old information because new information is learned. So it's called retroactive. There also could be proactive interference that interferes with short-term memory. And this is when you learn new information is hard, right? So you have a difficulty in learning new information because of already existing information you hold in your memory. Now, you also might want to know, what about long-term memory? Now, long-term memory seems to have no duration limit. And they think maybe there's an unlimited store of long-term memory. But what we can retrieve at any moment can be limited. And And then we can get into forgetting, and some research argue that maybe you never actually forget anything. Maybe you just lose the index and you can't find it anymore. But again, some researchers argue that, you know, long-term memory does last forever. We just lose that place card for where some of our memories are. Now, researchers break long-term memory into different components. We could talk about episodic memory. This involves episodes, like think about a TV show. Think about episodes on TV. These are like events. This is like your daily experiences. So if I asked you, what'd you do last Tuesday? Or you had a party the other day. What was your party like? Who was there, right? Who showed up? Or do you remember the time you fell off the jungle gym at school? These are all episodic memory. You can also think about semantic memories. These involve general knowledge. If I asked you who the first president of the United States was, or is Earth the third planet closest to the sun, you would say, yes, I know that. However, you probably don't remember the day and place you learned that information. Semantic memories are mostly just facts. Now, procedural memories, that's a memory on how to do something, right? Like riding a bike, baking a cake, driving a car. Once the skill is learned to some level, it's almost performed automatically. Well, somewhat automatically. This is how to do something. Now, that term working memory I alluded to earlier in the video. Well, working memory is one system that has been proposed for the control of memories that one encodes, stores, and retrieves from short-term memory. You can think of short-term memory as a fairly passive storage unit for information held over a short period of time. Working memory can be thought of as a system that controls the flow of information in and out of short-term memory. Basically, it keeps important information active in short-term memory when it is needed, and it uses the information to control the output from short-term memory. So if you want to think about it, the term working memory describes a system that controls the memories we are currently working on or operating on in our minds. Now, Baddeley and colleagues proposed the most predominant model of working memory. One thing that sets this model of working memory apart from short-term memory storage that we described earlier in this lecture, that it contains multiple subsystems, or it holds different types of information. Baddeley's model proposes the existence of a central executive subsystem that controls the flow of information between the storage subsystems and long-term memory, and decides one's attention will be at a given moment. The primary storage subsystems in working memory are the visual spatial sketchpad, the phonological loop, and there's also another component in there which he calls the episodic buffer. And this stores temporarily episodic information. And we're going to go into each one of these here. Now, the visual spatial sketchpad is responsible for the storage of visual information in working memory. It acts as a type of dry erase board for visual and spatial information that can be written on, stored for a brief period of time, erased, and rewritten on. Now, the phonological loop is proposed to operate much like the visual spatial sketchpad, but it's a storage subsystem for verbal information. Verbal information is stored in a loop in this subsystem and then is replaced by new verbal information as it comes in. Now, the episodic buffer that I mentioned is a subsystem of working memory proposed by Baddeley in 2000. And Baddeley proposed that it handles the brief storage of episodic memories when the loop or sketchpad are otherwise engaged. For example, when you're performing articulatory suppression, one's loop is completely engaged with the verbal repetition task, and it's unable to verbally store a list of items one wishes to remember. Now, Baddeley also had one other component to it, and that is the manager of the working memory system. He called it the central executive. Now, according to Baddeley, the central executive is a subsystem of working memory that controls the flow of information between the three storage subsystems that I just described. The flow of information between the episodic buffer, the long-term memory, right, and which part of the system is currently focusing the attention. So it kind of coordinates all these systems together. Now, One last thing I want to mention in this video is two types of retrieval from long-term memory. We have recall, so this is if you get an essay test and you're in school and your professor or teacher says write an essay, that's recall. Or if you have fill in the blank, this is recalling information from your memory. As opposed to multiple choice tests or true false, this is recognition, right? So you can recognize the correct answer that you experienced before. Both are two types of tests you probably weren't even aware that you do that test your long-term memory. With that said, I'll see you all in the next video.